Okay, we're continuing our discussion of the flaws. And in this clip, I want to continue discussing Abraham Joshua Heschel. But in this case, I want to address the question of the de-Westernization of Israel. Now, this notion of de-Westernization, it concerns not just the population. We know that Israel has a Western population. There are Ashkenazi Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews who have framed and shaped the very nature of the State of Israel and its founding culture. And when we're looking at new directions in contemporary Israeli society and culture, as you read the packet, you'll see that the phenomena that we're grappling with in the course are ones that call into question the notion that Israeli society is necessarily, or Israeli culture is necessarily Ashkenazi culture. We know that that is not the case, and it's being felt more and more, I think, in recent years, that the non-Ashkenazi framing of Jewish culture, whether it's in music and in literature and in all sorts of areas of public life, it's just moved much more significantly into the public sphere, and it's earned a much more equal place. I don't think it's quite there yet, and I hope that that direction will continue, but it's earned a much more equal place in terms of the evaluation of non-Ashkenazi Jewish culture. The cultural quality of it, the substance of it, is now being appreciated much more and being given a more equal place. This has implications as well for the relationship between the religious and the secular, because in Western thinking there's a very clear bifurcation between religious and secular, and one of the things that characterizes the non-Ashkenazi culture, and this is part of the process of de-Westernization, is that this stark distinction between the religious and the secular is not necessarily there. It's not there in the religious lives and practices of non-Ashkenazi Jews, but it's not there in the culture either. There's a clearer sense of how the Jewishness of secular culture, secular in inverted commas, is present. And the traditional texts and ideas and motifs play into public life much more naturally in Sephardic Jewish culture than in the Ashkenazi. And these are things that are changing the Jewish identity of the State of Israel, and they're having an impact on what I'm calling the de-Westernization of Israeli society and culture. But in this short clip, I'd like to touch on something else. And that something else is the de-Westernization of the very notion of the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. This is an issue which isn't just about the Ashkenazi versus the Sephardi. It's actually a notion that is about the difference between Western civilization and Jewish civilization. How do we understand sovereignty? How do we understand the sovereignty over a land? How do we understand our presence in the land? Now, this is a question which is dealt with in a very surprising and fresh way. Again, we're going back to Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose book, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, begins by addressing this question: what is the nature of sovereignty over land? That's really surprising. Here's the book, The Sabbath. And of course you would expect it to be about Shabbat and how you keep Shabbat, and what is the concept of Shabbat? What do we do when we sit around the dinner table, light candles, sing songs, make kiddush, take a day off? Heschel is very concerned with the notion of the Sabbath, the Shabbat, as a concept or a construction in time. He understands the shaping and the organizing of time. He refers to it as the architecture of time, as a very key prism for understanding the way in which the Jewish world thinks about space. It's quite an inversion. We think of the Shabbat as a palace in time, or even we could think of it as a Bet Mikdash, a temple in time. And if we can think of the Shabbat as a Bet Mikdash or as a palace in time, it means that we can think about places in the contexts of time categories and not of place categories. It's a very interesting little twist. Let me start by reading for you a little passage that doesn't appear in the text in front of you, and then we'll move to the text that you do have. Technical civilization is man's conquest of space. It is a triumph frequently achieved by sacrificing an essential ingredient of existence, namely time. In technical civilization, we expand time to gain space. To enhance our power in the world of space is our main objective. Yet to have more, man does not mean to be more. The power we attain in the world of space terminates abruptly at the borderline of time. But time is the heart of existence. This is actually a severe critique of Western politics. Heschel is drawing our attention to the way in which our whole political thinking is geared towards taking control of space. Mastering space, mastering objects, making space smaller. Think about the very concept of globalization and all the little machines that we have that enable us to take control of more space and to know what's going on everywhere all the time. And the extent to which we think of sovereignty as in the terms of space, in the terms of ownership, the terms in which we are able to subdue the things that exist in the world to serve our needs so that we have power. The exploitation of the resources of space, from Heschel's perspective, is what is fundamentally flawed in the way in which Western politics thinks about power, about sovereignty, and about the concept of the state. Now, the flip side of that is not to say there's no such thing as space, but it's to move space and the control of space into a framework of time. What's that framework of time? That framework is the concept of 6 days of the week we work, and on the 7th day we rest. He who wants to enter the holiness of the day must first lay down the profanity of clattering commerce, of being yoked to toil, to take a day off, to develop a sense of time as structuring our attitude to space, so that at equal intervals of every 7 days, we come to a spiritual space. We come to a space in time in which we stop, in which we shape our time to call attention to the spiritual meaning of our existence. He must go away from the screech of dissonant days, from the nervousness and fury of acquisitiveness and the betrayal in embezzling his own life. He must say farewell to manual work and learn to understand that the world has already been created and will survive without the help of man. To build a balance in time, and this is fundamentally connected to Heschel's understanding of the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, which of course moves in a cycle of time. Every 6 years we exploit the land. Think about it. All the things that we do here, being yoked to toil, being yoked to inquisitiveness, and the nervousness and the fury of inquisitiveness and embezzling the resources of the land, built into a structure of time every 7 years, we have to stop. We have to realize that the world has already been created. We have to realize that we're not really maintaining the land. We're not really owning the land. And when we exploit it, even when we exploit it for our own good purposes, we are exploiting something that exists without us and whose existence does not depend upon us. As such, there is a being or an ongoing of the being of the land that exists in time, which forces us to reflect upon the short span of time, which is essentially our lives. Living in the land is not power. It's not control. You're in the land. It isn't yours. 6 days a week we wrestle with the world, wringing profit from the earth. On the Sabbath, and here we can talk about the Sabbath of the week and the Sabbath of the land, we especially care for the seed of eternity planted in the soul. The world has our hands, but our soul belongs to someone else. 6 days a week, we seek to dominate the world. On the 7th day, we try to dominate the self. We try to look inwards. We try to address the spiritual meaning of what we do during the other 6 days of the week. We try to understand what it is with all that power, with all that embezzling, with all that creating, with all that taking charge, what it is that we're actually trying to serve. We try to orient ourselves towards an existence that allows us to gain deeper access to who we are. Now there's an interesting comment here on the relationship between the Western and the Jewish. It connects to the notion of the subject and the object. Is power, is control, is survival, is success dependent on what we do in the world around us, what we build, what we make happen, what we own, what we dominate? Or is it dependent on how we cultivate the inner self and how we have a sense of our personalities developing and becoming richer and becoming deeper and ultimately becoming more cognizant of the spiritual dimension of knowing ourselves fully in the aliveness of the depths of our spiritual being? For Heschel, the land of Israel and the Sabbath are very, very closely connected themes. And the idea that the land of Israel, because of the Shemitah, because it has its own time, because it has its own Sabbath, forces us to recognize that we don't control the land, but that the land conveys a message to us which feeds and enriches the process of our spiritual development. That whole definition, that whole description of the Sabbath actually invites us to think about the relationship between the people and the land in a completely different way. And I would argue that this is one of many, many examples in Jewish thought. I think it's a very rich one, but it's one of many examples in Jewish thought in which we're invited to think not in the Western terms of the 6 days of the week exclusively, but to introduce the concept of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat, so deeply into our culture and so deeply into the way in which we relate to our societies, our resources, and all the things that we have 6 days a week that are useless to us on the seventh. And by doing that, we can start to think about the relationship between the state, the people, and the land in which they live in Jewish terms rather than in Western terms, or rather than thinking about it exclusively in Western terms. And as such, this text, along with many others, is an invitation to think about the people and the land in non-Western terms, and in doing that, to address the challenge of the de-Westernization of Zionism. And the de-Westernization of Zionism, I think, is something that the reality of where the state of Israel is geographically and who lives in it demographically is a challenge that we just do not have any choice but to face.